Okay, so moving ahead. All right, so what I'm mainly going to focus on is civil commitment in Canada, or emergency detentions in particular, because that's the front end of this system. People are detained for a short period of time, could be days, hours, sometimes you're let go within hours, sometimes days, sometimes in some provinces actually weeks they can be held on this emergency detention. And then they may be formally committed for a longer period of time, and forced treatment and all that kicks in. But in terms of the data, really the only thing we can get very well at all is who's coming in that doorway. So that's mainly what I'm going to focus on today, is what's really happening at that front end. So let's just remind ourselves of what we're talking about today, because sometimes even force or involuntary becomes a euphemism. But any of these kinds of things can and do happen, and often many of them. So police apprehension, locked hospital and security guards, belonging, your clothes will be taken from you. There can be threats and pressure to comply. And I want to highlight that even though, as Jean-Laurent and Emmanuel were talking about, there are these extra criteria and processes for official forced treatment, I believe every jurisdiction in Canada has an emergency provision, so they can still forcibly drug you during this emergency detention period if they consider it an emergency situation of some kind. So these would typically be referred to as chemical restraints. They can also use physical restraints during this period, and there are locked seclusion rooms. All of these things are common practice, regular routine practice in psychiatric hospitals across the country. So the step one criterion is this, and we often drop this out of the discussion, but I think it's very important. It highlights that this is really, it's a discriminatory provision in all the laws across the country and really the world, which is that the step one is that you are determined to have a disorder of the mind. This may not even be actually a diagnostic criterion. Often it usually is these days, an actual mental disorder from the diagnostic manual. But what's important about that is these definitions of what a mental disorder is have expanded so much that basically today pretty well everyone will at some point meet the criteria for a mental disorder. So these are the latest numbers from the National Institute of Mental Health in the United States. They say every child by the age of 18 will have met the clinical diagnosis, 50% of children by the age of 18 will have met the clinical diagnosis of at least one mental disorder. And by age 45, a recent study in JAMA Psychiatry said 86% of adults will have met the criteria for one or more mental disorders. So really this is to say that 86% of the population will at some point meet the step one criterion for being involuntarily committed in Canada today. Next slide. So what is the step two criterion? Now, this is often not talked about. People still think that this is about danger or harm to self and others. Yes, that is still on the books in Canada, but across the country, the criteria have expanded broadly for when a person you can be held just under suspicion of these and actually formally committed if you're determined to meet these needs. But it's a risk of not meeting your own needs in some way. And the broadest one is risk of mental or physical deterioration. What does that mean? What's the translation for that? It's wide open. It has never been tested in court, but a lot of provinces had this on the books for 20 years or more, and to me, it sounds like it could mean anything, and for all intents and purposes, that was the intention, to give psychiatrists very broad discretion to detain people. And the broadest of all, interestingly enough, is in Alberta, where I am right now. And this one came about in an interesting way, because somebody did take the law to court, and the judge threw it out as overbroad. So this is too vague, it's capturing too many people. Clearly, the rates of involuntary commitment are skyrocketing. You have to do something about this. In this case, it was a person with a brain injury, and so they took that out of the law. They said, okay, we can't commit you just because you have a brain injury, so we'll take that out. But what they did, the government, is went back and broadened the law even more. So that's the criterion now. If you have a mental disorder and are likely to suffer negative effects, that's the criterion. So they have all the other ones as well, but this is one of the ones now. So what does that mean? It can mean anything at all. Next. All right, so here's the data, as you might predict. from this, Canada's doing this at really high rates. And basically, from the data we have, and it's not a lot, but in comparable countries, mostly Western countries is where we can get good data with comparable mental health systems. Canada's leading the charge now. For a long time, I thought the United States was, but it's taken us a long time to get this data. This is from the Canadian Institute for Health Information. I was asking them more than a decade ago to help in this because I was trying to get data from provinces and territories and really running into resistance. And yeah, I don't know what happened, but just a few years ago, they started working with governments to collect this data. And so this is now, we have the best data we've ever had in Canada, and it highlights that we are at the top of the pack at 317 people per 100,000, leading even the United States, which is clearly using this as an extension of their carceral system. And look at some of these comparisons. So we're 4 times higher than the UK. We are 20 times higher than Italy, and that's worthy of note because in Italy, they made a demonstrable effort starting decades ago to reduce coercion in their systems. They decided it was bad. When they started closing asylums, they said, let's also eliminate coercion, unlike some other countries. And so they set out to do it, and they've achieved it. And it's amazing. And unfortunately, even there now, there is an effort by some certain governments that are coming to power there to actually get rid of it, even though it's working so well. They just don't like the idea of how it works. So, all right, next. So here's the breakdown. This is fascinating. Again, we've never had this data, this ability to compare province to province. And so I want to highlight this is the number of detentions, the emergency detentions, people coming in at the front end. And so we see right away a broad range. These are the number of detentions in the middle, and then that's my own calculations of per 100,000 people. So you can see I've ordered them by the highest rate to the lowest. We see a wide range, 6 times as many at the top as compared to the bottom. The Northern Territories are at the highest rates, relatively small numbers of detention overall, but these are small populations as well. So it raises a lot of questions. Really, this whole thing just raises a million questions that I hope if any of you are researchers will actually delve into what's really going on there. I pull out Quebec and Alberta just because they were not part of this study that the Canadian Institute has been doing because they're collecting their data a bit differently. So Emmanuel has been working on Quebec. I think we're roughly going to end up there, and I'm working on Alberta right now, and I think we're going to roughly end up in that 200 range. So, lower than the average, but still pretty high compared to other countries. So, yeah. There it is. All right. Now I want to highlight what we don't know. This is important. So we call one of my colleagues in the US that researches this, David Cohen, came up with this term. He said, it's a black hole, and we have little to no data on the number of people. So that's the number of detentions. The best we can guess from other jurisdictions, about 5 to 20% of those seem to be repeat patients within 1 year. But we don't really know that. So the number of people versus the number of detentions. Demographic information, we have almost nothing. I'm going to highlight a couple pieces we just got this past year from this work, but overall we really don't know who are these people, what age, sex, gender, race, any of this kind of information. Duration of detentions. We don't know how long these detentions are actually lasting once people get formally committed. As was highlighted in the previous talk, we don't know anything really about forced treatment, and I want to emphasize that. So apart from, here we have the first national study that they've done, which is great, highlighting how the forced treatment processes kick in. We actually don't know how many people are being subjected to it and for how long. So we have no data on that whatsoever. And impacts and outcome, as Jean-Laurent was highlighting, we're not tracking that. So not only is it not being formally studied in the research, as he's highlighting, I'm highlighting that we got hospitals that are basically churning through operations of some kind with no information at all. Like, after we do this heart attack operation, are all our heart attack patients dying? No, like clearly I just made that up, right? Because we have no hospital in the country where they aren't tracking whether or not they're killing their own patients in these operations or what's happening to them. Are they improving their quality of life? Well, in the psychiatric system, we don't have any evidence at all. We're not tracking what happens to people after we force this upon them. And then I want to highlight the other thing we don't know anything about, we have no data on, and I'm going to go through a few slides of this now, is other forms of use of these laws and the ease with which these laws can be implemented also allows them to be used as threats a lot of times. And so I'm going to kind of go through some of those examples now. The next slide. All right, so on top of this, so none of these people are captured in the numbers you just saw that already put us at the top of the world for how often we do this. We're not counting there for voluntary admissions. It's very common that a person is simply told, hey, you know what? If you come here, stay here, take this drug, we won't commit you. Your chances of getting out are much easier, faster, but if you force us to commit you, which isn't that hard, then we're going to keep you for several weeks or months. And so a lot of people end up becoming voluntary patients for that. So all of these people are not being captured in these numbers right now. Then also any child, anybody who's under a guardianship, they're technically a voluntary patient because it's the parent or the guardian who's admitting them. And so they're doing it voluntarily. So the patient themselves, the child, is not being captured in this data, unless they actually are being forced against the will of the parent as well. So, and then also I've left out the entire criminal justice system. They use this extensively. We don't have great data there, but it's a whole different area. And they're using it increasingly in probation and parole. We have no data on that. There's a whole other one, which was highlighted briefly earlier, and I got some data here, little bit. So I want to the caveat is this data is coming from different sources. It's all over the map, but the extended leave, they call it community treatment orders, essentially outpatient commitment. This is a circumstance where you can be let out of the hospital, go to live in your own home in the community, but they'll still come and forcibly drug you in some way. You may be visited home, or you may be required to come in for an injection, a long-term acting injection once a month, some circumstance or other that you'll be continually forcibly treated. So in British Columbia, we got some recent data because this hit the news, and that's 103 people per 100,000. So you add that extra 100 to what we already had. And then Ontario, this is just the annual request for rights advice. That's the only thing they're tracking here in Ontario. So that number, you look at those two numbers and then look down where New York has, that's the continuing number of people. So compared to BC, which is the same data point, BC is 5 times higher than New York, which aggressively uses this tool a lot because they're trying, as we know, they're frequently in the news trying to use it to control homeless people and street people and violence and so on and so forth. So BC is using it 5 times more than they are. And the UK, which basically invented this tool, is way down there. And you can compare them to Ontario and Alberta because those are sort of similar data pools. So I'm just highlighting here, we're also using this tool more than anybody seemingly in the world. Only Australia certain parts of Australia seem to be in our ballpark. So who are these people? This is what we don't know. So what I just want to highlight here, and I'll just take my time to see how we're doing, is this is basically from my own research now. I'm just calling people up, interviewing, look at studies we do have from different jurisdictions, what's going on, all this stuff that I cobbled together for my book, and my book's out there, by the way. I think I still have a few available if you want to purchase one. But this reflects my own sense of really how these tools are being used in Canada today. And I put here kind of as a joke, but it's not a joke, just call 911 or 988, because these are the 2 most common ways that people are being brought into these systems. And either that or they're voluntarily admitting themselves to a hospital. Like, this is how I got interested in this. It happened to my father. He was going through a troubled time. He went to the hospital seeking some help, and they promptly and voluntarily involuntarily committed him. So this whole notion that we only do this to people who are refusing it because they don't have insight into their mental illness. I'm going to show you another number of data points here that highlight that that's just a wash. That's just totally not true. It's actually you're more common to get involuntarily committed if you're utilizing the system on a regular basis. You're exposed more often if you're a voluntary patient. So moving on. All right. So first thing we know, this is a bit of a shocker for people, but it's a minority of these people are unhoused people. So here's some of the data we have. A Pittsburgh study just came out recently. Phenomenal study, if you want to look at that. It's the best study we've ever had on the effectiveness of forced treatment. And they found that basically it worsened homelessness, it worsened violence, it worsened suicide. It's an amazing study. But anyway, they only found 3% of the people were actually homeless. In New York and Montreal, they got some data about 20%. So you're still disproportionately likely to be incarcerated if you're a homeless person relative to the homeless population. But as you can see, more than 80% of involuntarily committed people are not homeless. So that raises the question, who are they? And I just want to quickly highlight that bottom remark there. So there are studies on this. The studies that actually tracked deinstitutionalized patients after we closed large asylums, what happened to those people? The narrative out there is, oh, they all ended up homeless. But there's been about 30 studies. There are about 4 or 5 in Canada specifically, but in every Western country, we found they didn't end up homeless at all. The vast majority did not. The 2 Canadian studies found a couple of homeless people got after deinstitutionalization, and in most studies, it was less than 2%. So where did they end up? Next slide. So here's where they ended up. And this is something we don't talk about enough. So this is where long-term psychiatric patients are today. They're in residential treatment facilities, assisted living, and nursing homes. They're in group homes. They're in boarding houses and foster homes. They're in supportive housing, single-room occupancy. So this is what we did. We replaced asylums with these smaller facilities, and most long-term psychiatric patients are dispersed through these types of facilities. Very little tracking of it, very little regulating of it, what's really happening to them out there. And I want to highlight that apparently it looks like wherever we've got any kind of data, it's really common for these people to get involuntarily committed for brief hospitalizations. I think what's going on, and people that I've interviewed who work in these facilities, the people who've been patients in them say that it seems like it's used as a punishment and control tool. So it's you're misbehaving in the group home, we're sending you to the hospital, they're gonna up your meds, change your meds, scare you in some way, we might lock you up here for a long time, and then they send you back. And that seems to be a tool they're using. And we see other instances of that. Going to the next slide. So this is another piece of this coercion puzzle I want to talk about too. This is an amazing study. I can only assume it's happening in Canada as well. So they found that across 5 different cities in the US, 50% of people who are accessing voluntary mental health services in the community had experienced threats of forced hospitalization with their housing, their social security income, or another leverage held over to them, basically saying, you stay on those drugs or we're gonna lock you up, or we're gonna take away your social security income. Again, this is completely off the radar for tracking, but it seems like a very widespread practice. And so if you really want to understand the extent of psychiatric coercion in our communities, you need to kind of understand this. Next one. All right. This is another piece of this I want to highlight. This is an unaccountable power. It is an out-of-control power. It is used in every conceivable way possible, and this is the evidence right here. Every time we get an independent third party actually studying this, they highlight that often these are fraudulent, illegal commitments. So recent studies from British Columbia found that 72% of the commitments were illegal, and by that I mean paperwork wasn't properly filled out. Did the person have a diagnosis or not? The person was held longer than they could legally be held. They weren't told of their rights. They didn't get to appeal and so on. In Prince Edward Island, it was 100% were not meeting the legal criteria. They returned to British Columbia, the ombudsperson did, and found that still, even though they knew they were being monitored, the medical staff were only doing a legal incarceration 42% of the time. Next slide. Confidential crisis lines routinely use this as a tool to lock people up. So here's some data from Canada. people who are calling 988. This is now a network across the country. 3.6% of all calls result in emergency medical services or police being sent to that person's home and forcibly taken to a psychiatric hospital. That's a huge number. That adds up to 17,000 people annually. If you remember how many detentions there were, that's a quarter of all detentions in Canada, are people who are calling what they believe to be a confidential crisis line, just wanting to talk about their problems and not aware that this is a common practice, that their call may be traced and they be dragged up to a psychiatric hospital. Next slide. So families and situations of domestic conflict are a common way that these tools are used. These are often the ones that hit the news because it's family members either wanting more of it or, like in this case, Britney Spears protesting against it. Next slide. And what we found wherever we've got data is schools and parents are using this against children a lot. This is the fastest rising demographic that, as far as we know, when we get that age data, that it's children and youth. And we even have data from Florida showing that the rates drop dramatically during the summer months when school is out. So we know it's the teachers and administrators at schools using this against disruptive or distressed children a lot of times. And these numbers are quite high. And BC actually investigated this as well, and they found the same thing going on. I just want to highlight this. So this is the recent demographic data this past year we got in Canada that's showing, look at this, young girls under the age of 17 are twice as likely to be involuntarily committed as boys. Why? We don't know. We don't know why. Somebody needs to study that. And that trend is consistent right across the country, double in every province except a few of the Atlantic provinces. So what's going on there? We don't know. Let's check our time here. How are we doing? Oh, I'm doing all right for time. All right, next slide. So this is something that I was really shocked to discover myself the extent of it. So basically, every institution out there that knows about this power uses it. This is a picture of a fellow I got to know in British Columbia, in Victoria, Gordon Stewart, who he was protesting outside Canada Revenue offices. He had a long history with them, going back a decade, where they've ultimately issued him an apology. You know, I looked at the entire history, all the documents, showing that they had been screwing him over, his small business and all that. So he was outside there protesting, was gonna, you know, raise a lot of public concern about how corrupt Revenue Canada was, he thought. And he was out there and they kept calling 911 and the police would show up, interview him. Yeah, he's just a guy who wants to protest. And finally, they just dragged him up to the psychiatric hospital and he was locked up for 10 days until he finally actually agreed to speak. He was demanding his rights and wouldn't speak. And so they just kept him there, said, well, if you're not going to speak, we think you're crazy. And finally, he spoke and they're like, get out of here. And so, yeah. Anyway, what I found is this is common. So banks, airport security, any kind of public institutions and agencies, mental health practitioners themselves, of course, social workers, they all know about the ease with which this tool can be used. So in situations where it's not a criminal offense, they're apt to use this kind of a tool to control someone that they think might be in distress, might be upset, might be causing a ruckus in some way, and so on and so forth. Next slide. Okay, so I'll just whip through this quickly because Jean-Laurent was really covering this, although I want to highlight some of the quotes from the peer-reviewed search. So is any of this helpful? We're doing it, it's expanding, you know, so much, we're using it throughout society. Is it actually helping people in any way? And so these are some quotes I pulled, my journalism side, you know, looking at it. And what I found is a whole bunch of people like Jean-Laurent and Emmanuel had gone before me as well, trying to find out what is the evidence for the effectiveness of any of these coercive practices, including forced treatment, so also restraints and so on and so forth. Are any of these practices effective at what they're purported to be used for? And so the key thing I found is that perceived coercion is key. So you can sometimes be committed, but a person can treat you very respectfully. Hey, we're really sorry we have to do this. You know, have you ever tried a medication before? Would you like to? It can be a respectful process, and that can be okay for people. So that that kind of muddies the data and actually inflates the perspective of how bad this experience really is. As soon as somebody says they perceived that they were being coerced one way or another, that they were kind of threatened or pressured in some way, any sort of sense of respect or gratefulness or thankfulness just plummets, drops off the edge. And that's what's reflected throughout. And so other researchers had gone into this question before me, does it help, does it work? And here's some quotes. It's based on tradition rather than evidence. Psychiatric forced medication is remarkably understudied practice. Next slide. A remarkable lack of evidence to support use of seclusion or physical or chemical restraints. Little evidence coercive interventions confer any clinical benefits, and you'll see no reductions in serious violence. And suicides seem to increase 100 times or more after an involuntary psychiatric hospitalization. Interestingly, it's even higher for when you mix in together voluntary and involuntary. So all the debate's still out there as to why, but we can demonstrably show every single study that's looked at this, within 3 months of a psychiatric hospitalization, people are hundreds of times more likely to kill themselves. And that's even when they sub-analyze the people who weren't suicidal to begin with. So something is happening in a psychiatric hospital that's really making people suicidal. And we should be talking about that more, or seems to be. We can't prove the cause and effect, but it's very, very suggestive and concerning. Next slide. So as a result of all this, because we're not the only ones that have visited this, when they did the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, they had these kind of extensive consultations with all these stakeholder groups. They looked at the scientific evidence that was there, and they concluded ultimately, they and the associated committees, that involuntary commitment and forced treatment are arbitrary detention and torture. And the World Health Organization has now called for a complete abolition of involuntary commitment and forced treatment, and they've issued guides for non-coercive mental health systems. So that's kind of where we're at. I mean, that whole division has now been wiped out because of the developments with the United States pulling funding for the World Health Organization. So it's been axed, so we don't know what the future is for that division within the World Health Organization. But that got said. Next slide. And so if we don't get abolition soon, because let's face it, our whole culture is going in the opposite direction right now, what else could we do? Well, I want to say, I believe that if we tracked and publicly recorded impacts and outcomes, that would change public perception of this. If everyone knew what we have just shared with you here today, I think that would change people's attitudes about this, and there'd be a lot better things going on within the system. The World Health Organization has issued specific guides looking at pilot projects around the world for peer involvement, non-medical approaches, because right now you can't actually get therapy. You know, a lot of people like therapy and counseling. You can't really get that in an average psychiatric hospital today. You know, and that's one of the things that people find most distressing. You can really only get drugs. And sometimes they might have a group therapy session or something like that, but you don't get any kind of intensive therapeutic interventions. Next slide. So, of course, if we just narrowed those laws down again, put clearer standards of care, and just strengthen regulatory oversight, because I highlighted earlier, right? Most of these are actually fraudulent, illegal processes already, even though they have such broad discretionary powers. So at least if we had better oversight, and I love the recommendation that Jean-Laurent put forth of an investigative body, we'd absolutely need that. I suggest demedicalizing mental health law powers. Currently in all mental health law, the top person with all the power is the medically trained psychiatrist or physician. Why, right? Why is that? I mean, it's because we've got this history of the medicalization of this profession, but there's no real reason to think that way. We know that a lot of distress that people go through is not necessarily provoked by something happening in their bodies. There's no evidence to support the biomedical model, per se, of mental illness. So maybe we could make this an interdisciplinary team of some kind that might oversee an involuntary commitment, and they could talk together, and there would be a non-hierarchical approach to decision-making. Next. Allow and enforce psychiatric advance directives. A lot of people are shocked to discover this because in Canada, the Supreme Court has upheld your right to an advance directive for every other kind of health care. But in Canada, they're often specifically outlawed in specific jurisdictions where they say you can't have it, or they just specify that the mental health law, if they want to, they can override your advance directive. That being, if you say, you know, if in future I'm ever deemed incompetent, then this is what I want to happen. Here's who I want to represent me. Here are the drugs I'll accept and not accept. You can't say that for mental health involuntary commitment right now. And then finally, address the true needs of all these people I highlighted. Like, why are housing providers using this tool? Why are schools, why are nursing homes using this tool? Let's find out, let's try to solve their problem and say, don't involuntarily commit people. Let's address this another way. So lastly, I just want to highlight, this is something everyone can do in their daily lives on a regular basis, and that is clearly distinguish things that are getting kind of bled together a lot. Helping and policing. Often people say, oh, we're doing this very compassionately, we really want to help people. And then you say, well then, why don't you talk with them about what they want and what will help them and work with them? And then they're like, well, because they're dangerous and they're out of control and they're, you know, they're separated from reality. And you're like, okay, so which is it? Which is it? Don't just sort of switch back and forth with what your rationale is. So separate this helping notion and the policing notion and just say, which one are we talking about? Okay, now let's talk about that without switching back and forth. Same thing with detention and treatment. I think a lot of us can understand a situation where, you know, if I run out and start beating on somebody right now, you know, we would hope maybe other people would try to physically intervene and stop me. So I think a lot of us can imagine a situation where we could say, yeah, maybe that should happen. Maybe that person needs to be physically stopped from doing what they're doing. But that's not the same as getting into your brain and mucking around with your brain and forcing you to take drugs. So let's separate those two things out from each other. Talk about one and then the other separately from each other. And then finally, I just want to highlight everything that sort of drives home my talk today is just, let's emphasize that commitment is not only a civil rights issue, it's also something that many people experience as abusive, as humiliating, as traumatizing, as terrifying. And even people I know who've personally experienced childhood sexual abuse, or rape, violent abuse of some kind, have said their experience of involuntary commitment was as bad or worse. And I just want to double down on that. People who've experienced it before are making that comparison, not only people who haven't experienced it, who also sometimes make that comparison. So this is something we really need to take seriously as a society. We can't just sort of, you know, gloss over that. It's not just a civil rights issue. This is an issue of violent abuse being perpetrated by the state. Some people regard it as the most traumatic experience of their lives. And even if that turns out to be a small percentage, and we can't say that it's a small percentage, we don't have the data, but even if it turns out, that's still a very, very significant thing that we need to address. So thank you very much for listening. All right.